So appreciate y'all for being up here and taking the time. Appreciate y'all for joining us. I'll just say very briefly, I moved back to El Paso about 3 years ago after living in San Antonio and kind of bouncing around the country in search of whatever newspaper would hire me. Fortunately, got the opportunity to come back thanks to Bob. Got my wife to move back here. We had our son Francisco born in December, so I'm trying to fight against the trends that Bob's laying out here, and I'm doing my part here. So that's where we're at. But I'll say this too, though. The reality is, some of my closest friends, guys I grew up with, products of EPISD, products of Franklin High School, go Cougars, they're making big bucks in Austin, Houston, San Francisco, working for big companies. And so, I'm more the sort of, I'm not the normal, I guess, when El Paso. As you guys know, a lot of people move and pursue much greater incomes elsewhere. So that's the problem we're fighting against. Anyways, so we'll get going here. Again, appreciate you guys for joining us. I'll start with Casey. I wonder, both the public and private sector play a big role in housing, especially with affordable housing. And so I just wonder how the private sector is addressing housing needs here and what policymakers can do to help you with housing.
So I think when we talk about housing, the first thing we need to talk about is not necessarily demographics, but household composition. So I think on the private sector, where we're finding a shift in what we're building and what historically the older product that's already in El Paso caters to is very different than what we need for the future. We do have a senior population that's changing dramatically, and I can tell you, in our company, we run housing. We have about almost 10,000 households, and we serve on a tax credit and affordability level. We have 37 communities that are part of an HFC, and then we also have high-end product, and we're doing development at that level too. And we've seen a dramatic shift in both areas. So on the private side, we're looking at catering housing maybe towards multi-generational housing, townhomes that have the ability for a casita behind it, maybe a mother-in-law quarter, because we're seeing extended housing. But I think that the private sector has three main responsibilities. One is to add to the supply pipeline. Two is to preserve the existing housing, because as we talk about housing shortages, preservation of existing product is often overlooked. And there's really no assistance. There's not a lot of private-public partnerships for existing housing. Everyone talks about building new housing. Oh, we need more, we need more, we need more. We need to take care of what we already have too, and make sure that we upgrade it and that we bring it to a level that it meets current needs. So for example, if you have a large supply of 3-bedroom apartments that are available, but you're finding that the household composition size is a little different, is there money out there? Is there the availability with a private-public partnership to adapt that housing to cater towards seniors in that household who might be living with their children now because of affordability? It changes a little. I think on the public side, there's so many opportunities, and somebody said earlier they had a laundry list. I brought mine, but if you want a copy, you can have it afterwards. AI helped with that too, so I'm happy to share it with you. But I think from the public side, it's making the process easier. We still talk about building, and there's a lot of talking about building on the fringe of El Paso, but infill opportunities are there if we make it easier. If we have a dedicated plan, a one-stop shop, where we go to one planner, one application, and we make the process easier from start to finish. And then we bridge that gap between private sector costs, which aren't often affordable, and then we look at what the public needs are, and then we find that we meet that gap in the middle. How do we create a regular conversation with strong private investors, but a dedicated line with the city of El Paso and or other resources out there to say, this is where you go if you're trying to accomplish this. I think meeting those housing demands is important, but preservation of what we have already is important too.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up quickly. I've since purchased a home, but I got the opportunity to live in Sunset Heights, which I was very excited for. I was riding my bike to our office, and the ceiling was caving in our house, and I had to move out. So it was a very historic home. I love the sort of downtown setting, but I appreciate your comments about sort of preserving what we have existing, because
I don't manage that house that he's talking about.
And I wasn't suggesting
for the record.
you do. But anyways, it's I know challenges associated with that. Anyways, Shelly, I want to go to you. El Paso Home has some interesting data that indicates higher income El Pasoans are increasingly likely to rent rather than own homes, which may squeeze out middle and lower income renters. And so if we don't build more housing stock. So I just wonder if you can talk about that and explore what it takes to serve renters of all incomes in El Paso.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we call it the housing paradox, or the El Paso paradox, because it is really centric to El Paso. I'm in the affordable space. All of our properties are affordable, but we're being squeezed out by higher income renters. And it's just, like Casey mentioned, it's just the makeup of households. 5 years ago, the average household was 3 persons. That number has declined. And what it does, it adds approximately 2,000 new households into El Paso. So while population might be declining, the need for multifamily housing is increasing. We are way behind in building multifamily housing. I think in the next 5 years, there's 500 units in the pipeline. We are 2,000, the number per year is 2,000. I mean, by 2030, we're gonna be 8,000 behind affordable and market rate. So what we found is, since in the past 5 years, the number of households making greater than $150,000 has doubled. Renters. They're not buying homes, they're renting. So the occupancy levels of market rate properties is functionally 100%. And that they're taking up what we would otherwise put vouchers on for the other multifamily. We're being pushed down. So our need for affordable, and we're talking, households that make 30% AMI or 40% AMI, even 80% AMI cannot afford a market rate. You have to make $80,000 on average to afford a market rate property in El Paso. Average AMI in El Paso is $62,000 a year. So the need is great, and we just need to keep building.
Yeah, I want to come back to that topic in a minute about maybe how we can sort of accelerate the construction of multifamily housing. But Georgina, I just want to ask you, I wonder how you've seen how rising prices, especially with utility bills, everybody's seeing the escalating electric bills in particular, as well as water bills. How are rising prices, rising utility bills impacting low and moderate income El Pasoans, and what approaches are needed to address that?
Thank you. So, there you go. Thank you. Yes. So as prices rise, the first thing that goes for families, and there's no additional income coming in, or there's no credit availability. What families start focusing on is the basic needs, right? They start negotiating that, and an example is groceries. So as opposed to maybe going for the most nutrition option, they may go for the cheaper option. That's one way to look at it. Obviously, they eliminate all the snacks. The households also start sacrificing medication in some cases, and they may start rationing their medicine. In a household where there may be like high blood pressure or diabetes and mental health medication, mental health is the first one to go. We all know that this in the long run may eventually result in a hospitalization or an emergency room visit, which will bring in a high bill at the end. Going back to a little bit what Shelley was saying, I'm sorry, in addition to that, before I move on to the next one is, those that may have savings, obviously those savings deplete. And all of this really causes stressors within the family that can result in, we talked a little about the education, so school absences, it could result in neglect and abuse within the households because of the stress that it brings into the family. But I do want to go back to a little bit to the housing and the demographics. In El Paso, 51% of our population is not able to afford basic needs. So housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, technology. 19% of those fall underneath the poverty level, and 32% are what we call ALICE households, which are asset limited, income constrained employed households. They make more than over the limit of the poverty level, but they still don't make enough to meet just the basic needs, right? So it's just very important to keep that in mind whenever we do any of the initiatives.
Yeah, and just one comment I'll add. My sort of area I really am into is utilities and water and electric. And one of the big drivers of the rate increase El Paso Electric just imposed that's escalating all of our bills in addition to the hot weather is greater spending on distribution infrastructure, the poles and wires that El Paso Electric builds as we expand further out. Just to bring it back to housing, we expand out to Horizon and Northwest and Northeast. And a result of that is the utility spends more on poles and wires and bakes that into our rate. So that's just one outcome of sprawl is the, an impact on utility bills as well and household affordability. Cindy, I'll go to you. Your role on the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs gives you pretty good insight into housing issues across the state. And so I wonder, what can the rest of Texas learn from El Paso, and vice versa? What can El Paso learn from the rest of Texas?
Thank you. It's a privilege to actually serve on this board of Housing and Community Affairs. And what I've noticed there is, one thing. I'm the first person to sit on this board in 20 years. And one of the first things that I learned going to my first probably 6 or 7 months of board meetings is that no one really knows much or cares much about west of I-35. And a lot of that is because we're not at the table. And I really want to encourage people to seek out and try to serve on a board across the state, because we need more El Pasoans to do this. And I'm not saying that they're callous and they don't think about us, but if you're not at the table, they don't see you. And the other thing that I've noticed sitting out there is everybody refers to West Texas as Lubbock, which I keep reminding, if you get on I-10, you can go a lot further west before you're to make this. But that is just something that I saw, and I still see, but not as much anymore. I will say, sitting at that table now, when pilot programs come out, they do mention this will be piloted in El Paso, and they'll give me a year. So now it's forcing the conversation because you've got someone at the table. If you're not at the table, you're not seen, and that doesn't mean you're on the menu. It might mean you're not even on you're not even thought of as a menu item to eliminate or whatever. So I would encourage that. That's the first thing that I really wanted to say about serving on housing, to encourage you all, because these things that we're discussing are not just limited to this topic. What I do see that the rest of the state does is there are most of the bigger cities and a lot of, you're seeing Waco, there are a lot more people that are coming forward to look for tax credits to build multifamily housing units. And we need to get our developers out there to say, let's do this. And I know that that's not necessarily easy, but but we're trying. What we do better, and I know, like, listening to you is kind of funny, but only because you made the mention about the process, it takes a while. We're actually one of the better communities to get like your construction review process through. You can basically about 2 weeks, although there are some bogs. I have seen sitting on this board where people come in and say, look, we're behind in our thing because our review process, our permitting has taken months. And sometimes they can't close out a deal because they put in a tree that, a community, a permitting, they're like, we don't like that tree. So they have to take out all these trees, right? Those are things that like around the rest of the state does. So while yes, there are some issues here to get your construction review process, understand it's much better than it is across the state. Some of the challenge, what we did, and I'm not even going to say we, but I will say this, what the housing, back when it was called the Housing Authority of El Paso did, and now it's Home. And when you drive down the street and you see those buildings that have the big home sign, I think under the creativity of Jerry Chacon, he utilized a program that HUD has called the Rental Assistance Demonstration. The D always throws me off. Demonstration program, but really what that did is it took private equity and public housing and it turned units. We have all these units, right, that are old, but they need rehabilitation, which is why you can't live in Sunset Heights, is why if you want to live anywhere central El Paso and you're a young household, maybe you can afford the mortgage, but you can't afford, getting rid of the cloth wiring. What this program did is it allowed that public housing units could actually be turned into tax credits, and that you could get a mixture of private equity, you could get low-income, what's LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, bond financing to rehabilitate these units and make them so that this, that your inventory is still useful. I know we've all seen images, especially in movies, of like you drive by and you see these old public housing things like in New York, and they're abandoned, right? And they're cordoned off, but they're right in the middle of a neighborhood. This program helped that. And Jerry was one of the first, I think he's maybe still the only one who's actually converted, your department actually converted the majority of its housing stock into this. Utilized this program. So it benefited everybody. It benefited the renter, it benefited the people that were investing in it, invested the builders that were putting money into it. And it was it's a really great program. And I think, you know, when I asked people at housing, what do we do better? They said, this is what El Paso's done really well. And so I think really the utilization of public-private partnerships is what will really, across the board on everything that we do, will enhance this community.
Thanks for that, Cindy. And this next question will be for all panelists, but maybe back to you, Shelley. To start, just to get to your point about El Paso's population has been pretty flat over the last decade or so, but at the same time, the number of households have increased, and we need more housing. And so I just wonder, how does El Paso make sure that the housing stock being added meets the needs of the people living here, and just how policymakers can ensure that?
Well, I feel like I'm on a panel with the principal who's overseeing us. It's on my stage. But I think the tax credit program and what TDHCA does for El Paso and our region is critical. It really does flow the equity that allows us to continue construction, so long as El Paso continues to maximize the credits that are allocated to the region, and utilize those to, you know, I guess, rehabilitate existing and bring in new units. You know, shout out to Home. All of our units are no more than 8 years old. I mean, and we use RAD to do that. We use these public-private partnership. We got a bond rating, and that allowed us to build a capital stack where deals will pencil, where you can continue to build even though the cost of construction has increased tremendously. It's just being innovative with where you get your funding.
Anybody else want to take a stab at how we sort of add more housing and make it sure it's at all income levels?
Casey alluded to this, but I'll say it because it's not necessarily popular. But we kind of we could look at our zoning policies. Right now, we do have a policy that you can only build one unit per lot. In El Paso, we need more multifamily housing than we need single family housing. We need townhouses, we need duplexes, we need a little bit more apartments if we're going to meet that need. And right now, I think we do know, and you can correct me if my statistics off, but I think right now we're about 16,000 units behind. And in the future, we're looking at an additional 17. So if you think about that, we're 33,000 units behind to meet our needs. And so I know I get to hear this a lot because I do work at a bank. If the zoning laws weren't so restrictive, you know, builders would be doing more. So I would add that.
So I would say to add to that, if we're thinking outside of the box, maybe something that's taking the model even for what Home has done so well for El Paso. I was part of the RAD development program. I got to house everybody while they redid their units. So all of their renters stayed with me for about 5 years while they redid all of their units, and then we sent them back, and they live in their brand new housing. And maybe looking at opportunities through TDHCA and with a seat at the table at a Texas level to look at RAD opportunities for private developers and opportunities to go through that same program on a large scale. There are a very limited number of private developers or tax credit holders who take the majority of those funds that are available, and that's how they get awarded. And maybe opening up that door and opening up that program to expand that partnership for local private developers or existing property owners on a very small scale. Usually your tax credit holders are the people who are doing the most units at the largest level, and to create programs for individuals. You know, maybe you have 10 units that you really need to bring on the line and you don't have washer dryer connections, so you're really struggling to compete. You know, you've got a lot of square footage and you could convert it to make it more accessible for a senior household. I think having those programs, if you're catering to that market and that demographic group, that household group, if you can prove that there's a public benefit maybe creating more opportunities for those private equity holders.
And then Georgina, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on, I guess, a different version of the question, just on sort of housing stress and affordability as you see it from your perspective at United Way.
I think something to consider when it comes to developing, and what we see is a lot of the developments are, and I think that's maybe the next question, but it's how they're built on the outskirts, where we see that more and more. 79901 is still the zip code that with the most need in our county, and instead of it going to the outskirts, right? And if as we develop these, we have these developments where there are no, hospitals or schools nearby, it really puts even more hardship on that household. So it's just keeping that in mind. I know it's the private-public partnerships that I think has been successful in other markets, to be able to bring that social component to it as well, or social cost component when we do affordable housing.
Yeah, and I guess just to add on, sort of on this sprawl topic, right? And just the fact that most of the new housing we see is built on the fringes of the city. I alluded to it earlier a lot. We see in Horizon and Northeast and Northwest in particular. And so I just wonder, but that's where land is most plentiful and cheapest and so forth. But as a result, we've got kind of this slowing population. We're sort of spreading out more. We're spreading costs more for infrastructure out. Just wonder if y'all have any thoughts on how El Paso should address that. Is it up to, renovating infill development or properties? Just wonder generally your thoughts on the sprawl effect and maybe ways to mitigate that. Anybody?
Well, I would say that is Home's priority, and we're actively involved in discussions with the school districts about infill development. They have unoccupied schools that are on their surplus list. The city is also involved in those discussions. I think that there is a collaborative consensus that infill development is necessary. But remember, scoring for tax credits requires proximity to certain amenities. And so the master plan for the city, the county, has to include housing and where multifamily housing can go.
Can you expand just on that a little bit, on the empty schools and maybe the challenges or opportunities there for housing? I mean, I hear people all the time, oh, why don't we convert this close school or that close school into apartments or whatever. Just wonder if you can just speak briefly on how difficult that is to do, right?
Well, the schools that we've looked at, and I don't want to overstate, but they're older properties, and the cost of demolition and abatement, because they're mostly lead-based paint, they have asbestos, the cost of demolition far exceeds the value of the property. So when you put that into the cost of developing that, it becomes tremendously expensive. So that's why everybody has to sit at the table to make sure that the project can go forward, because it does benefit all of the players at the table. It brings more students into the area. It puts butts in seats for the school districts. It creates amenities at different retail outlets. So everybody has it's the benefit is there. It's just getting to the point where it makes financial sense.
Any thoughts on the question of sprawl and?
Well, I think that when you consider infill, maybe having a strategic plan with the city for developers that's out there that has already identified those infill areas where infrastructure, utility capacity is already there, transit's already there, job opportunities there, and you can identify those resources as an opportunity for those houses instead of private developers going out and trying to find that and then finding that barrier with infrastructure or that barrier with utilities after the fact. That the reality is tearing down property is as expensive as building it. When you look at that cost as a whole, you're doubling the cost to build. So we've got to find resources there too. But I think that if we had kind of almost designated areas that say, hey, this is a great infill capacity because those barriers are already removed, it makes it a little easier. We're trying to do that. We've been building out Montecillo for what was a 12-year plan and will be a 25-year plan now. And we'll continue to do it. So infill is one of our priorities. It's one of our challenges. But I think having designated areas for other developers to look at would be really helpful. you know, maybe kind of like a star rating. This is a 5-star area that eliminates those barriers, and it's a great place to start, identified not only for the housing authority, but also for private capital.
Can I also add, I think on individual basis as well, it's working with the city, because I feel there's not a motivation to upkeep your property, because then the cost will go up, like the tax, you know, the property taxes will go up. And then people can't afford to live like central-ish anymore, and they have to go further away. So I think it's that perception of, oh, well, if I'm gonna remodel, you know, I can't let the city, you know that I'm remodeling, or maybe it's just cheaper to go outside. I don't think there's that motivation as a community to upkeep our property, to keep it, which in the long run, it's better for the community. I mean, it looks better, right?
Good point. Any thoughts, Cindy, on sprawl or how to mitigate that? Or maybe we shouldn't.
I don't know my ideas on sprawl. No, I do understand, and when I listen to you, Daniel, that, you know, you used to live in Kern as well. But the thing is it is expensive to rehabilitate an older neighborhood. You know, people that decide to live in these older neighborhoods know that it's not the cost of what you're buying the house for. It's also the cost of, I mean, me personally, we moved into our house about 20 years ago when you could have cloth wire. Well, we have finally got all the cloth wire out of our house, but had we done that initially, like today, that cost would be over $100,000, which adds to that. If you're a 2-income family and you have kids, yeah, going on the outskirts and driving 40 minutes to get to work makes sense. It's economical. And so we do have to address that. We have to, you know, look at the reasons why people have moved out, you know, and encouraged all this sprawl. I think we have a lot of opportunities, and I think listening to this panel, I can see that there are a lot of good minds at working here on that. You know, and I do still, I'm going to emphasize, I think what we all have emphasized is that the public-private sectors working together always produces something better for the community, and it's what makes us strong.
I'll just add, maybe I'm a naive idealist, but my father lives at the Fairmont along the, you know, the streetcar rack, and so it's really wonderful. He hops on there and goes downtown and goes around town, and it's very easy to see him. And so I probably won't win many friends from the Kern Place Neighborhood Association, but I think we should have a lot more Fairmont-style housing and multi-story housing and so forth built on kind of corridors like that, although I know I might get slapped in the face if I say that too loud.
No. You know what? I really agree. And one of the things that I have seen, and it's not just El Paso, but I see it even more so across the state, is this NIMBYism, right? I cannot tell you how many times I've listened to people come forth and say, look, we're all for public affordable housing. We're all for this. And, you know, but if you look at it, this area is better for it than this one. And it's just like, oh, I'm so glad you're so thoughtful of people that can't afford housing, but you don't want them in your neighborhood. And so, you know, and I actually apply this to a lot of things. We want the benefits of everything, but we don't want it in our backyard. And we've got to get rid of that mindset, right? If it's not our backyard, it's someone's, you know. And so we really need to just, we need to ask ourselves, who are we as a people when it comes to what do we want? What kind of a society do we want? And are we willing to make that sacrifice? Are we willing to have these public housing projects, these public housing homes? And I really want to even take that back one step. People that are looking for this help are school teachers. They're firefighters. These are not, you know, doctors and lawyers and people making great money. These are people that are doing us a huge service, right? Our firefighters, when they can't afford to buy a house, there's something really wrong, right? Because we rely on them. And to say we don't want housing that they can afford in our neighborhood, it just blows my mind. Like, you know, well, where should they live?
I want to give a shout out to the home team. Our CFO lives in a home property. Our director of our HCV, which is Section 8, lives in a home property. We don't build what we don't live in. So, I mean, the NIMBYism is a huge issue. I don't want to discredit that, but I think that as a collective whole, I mean, we're housing your moms and dads, and we're housing your grandchildren. So it is an issue. It is a huge issue.
Any thoughts, Casey? Or?
Well, I think it goes back to some of the earlier presentations. I think when you look at El Paso on a whole and our wage levels here, the fact is that 60% of El Paso is under 80% AMI. Whether you call it an affordable community or whether it's a rental house on your block, the fact is that we need to find a way to make preservation of existing product affordable. We have to maintain the housing pool that we already have. And that's really difficult to do when you're sitting at 80% of AMI and you're living paycheck to paycheck. And as, you know, when people talk about rent, and it's really funny because there's a lot of analysis on rent. Rent isn't cost of living. If you talk to one of my renters, if I discuss rent, they're thinking about electric and water. They're thinking about gas. They're thinking about their total cost of living for that household. And if we don't find a way to raise the wage in El Paso, preservation of housing is one conversation, building new housing is another, but we aren't going to have the people that we need living in that housing long term because they're going to continue to leave El Paso. So we've got to address the wage issue on the front of it too. We've had the same issue just developing market rate apartments, whether it's housing, whether it's considered affordable or not. There's this misconception that community living is somehow a negative, and it's really not. As long as we make sure that the infrastructure and transportation keeps up with it, it's a blessing in the neighborhood. The tax dollars are there. The added benefits for the neighborhood are there. Businesses survive and thrive in that area. It's a win for everybody. But there's multiple issues that we have to address to make that work.
Any comments to close, Georgina?
I mean, when it comes to just the affordability, again, it's just going back to maybe, and this is just a meeting that I recently had with the city, is maybe seeing other opportunities for other people to also get involved and help and come and sit at the table, whether it's nonprofits or other business sectors that may not have any development expertise, but can bring a lot, you know, of other types of support. So it's a collective and more of a coordinated effort. I think that would be, that's what our meeting was, and we may get involved, yeah.
I think we're out of time here, but appreciate y'all for your time and taking some time to chat with me. And thank y'all for listening.